The existential risks are interesting because they're kind of abstract and hard to point to. However, many of the subject matter experts that are very vocal right now talk about the existential risks as opposed to the practical risks. So how do we sort some of the potential dangers? Like maybe on the one hand, there is the Nick Bostrom gray goo, and we will transform the universe into uh, just things that feed robots. That's fine. But then there is the real risks of disinformation and perhaps job
Mhm.
displacement. So how, like, where on that spectrum, which is an extreme spectrum, should we place the actual real potential risks?
That is the million-dollar question, Dan. And I think that's why I do the work that I do. Because talking about either technology in its most, catastrophic, intense, amazing way or worst, impossible, inaccessible way is not how technology actually works in the real world, right? And so the way that I sort of think about bringing those two, um, I don't want to even call them sides, but camps together. And in reality, like there are very loud voices in either camp, if we're even going to call them that. But most people are really sort of more in the middle. It's not actually as polarized or divergent, I think, as the media and sort of the discussions around AI, generative AI have made it seem. Back to what I said in sort of the opening, you know, let's classify these risks. Let's understand them, and really understand too what problems are we trying to solve with these technologies. We need to think about technology, and this is what I do in my daily job at Cantellis. Helping different types of organizations, customers, clients understand the applied technology use in front of them, what problem they're trying to solve with that technology, and the risks that can result from those problems, right, or those applications. And so I think that, we're getting very excited about all of the possibilities or all the ways that this technology could go wrong that are sort of like up here. And yes, these technologies are amazingly powerful and they're starting to do some really, really interesting things, like there was a paper from Microsoft Research a few months ago that sort of started to show that generative AI had some types of sentient abilities, right? Like that's really, really cool. But those technologies are far away from being sort of used in applied settings, or at least with the organization with which I work. And so aligning those perspectives, aligning these problems to me really comes down to looking at where the technology is being applied today, maybe where it's being applied in the next couple of months, and what the risks that we already know that are very well documented, that we know how to manage. How do we think about those, and how can we sort of start thinking about those in new contexts, but using a lot of the same tools and processes that we already have in our toolkits to manage these technologies. And those are, having a well-defined problem, involving a broad set of stakeholders when you're scoping a new problem or using a new sort of powerful technology or AI capability, documenting why and what you're wanting to do with the technology, for what purpose, the types of data that you're using, and where you're getting it from, doing things that are, consistent with robust privacy practices that most organizations have been using for now many years. Consent, notice, giving users a choice to have their data used for this type of technology if you're using personal data. And then, thinking about possible impact. So looking at things like impact assessments, different types of, as I mentioned, documentation frameworks to really sort of think about and analyze these risks. And these are all things that take work and time, and focus, right? And I think that, um, for the same reasons that we're very excited about these technologies, it's hard to kind of pull that focus back down to earth and say, hang on, we know how to manage these, we know what to do. Let's make a plan and do it and put resources and action toward that, in addition to being excited about the tech.
I think what you just described are good guide rails for businesses developing policies around
Mhm.
using generative AI. But how do regulators create policy that looks into the future that protects not just business, but democratic norms and the public?
Yeah, like I said, that is the even more hot and exciting question of the last few months. I think that, approaching good regulation involves a lot of stakeholder input, and we're seeing a lot of that certainly in the United States with new proposals coming out of Congress, like the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer's new Safe Innovation Framework. But I think that what's sort of missing and where we need to really go a step further now that we've had a lot of these stakeholder discussions is getting down to where the rubber meets the road and what we can really start expecting from organizations to be doing when it comes to a lot of the things I just mentioned about assessing the risks of AI within their organizations and on sort of a problem or capability specific basis. So you know, there's been a lot of commentary, particularly in the US, about figuring out sort of where we need to go and consulting with stakeholders and kind of figuring out what's next. And the reality is that we've done a lot of that, right? We've had a couple of independent or government advisory committees, both with the National Security Commission on AI and the National AI Advisory Committee over the last couple of years, come up with recommendations, ideas, convene experts to sort of talk about this stuff. And we need to start acting on those recommendations. And, some of those are looking at where existing law already applies in different AI contexts. So, for example, anti-discrimination law, unfair or deceptive practices, right? There's a lot of areas of the law which could hypothetically or technically apply to different AI contexts. And we just don't have, the enforcement and or sort of practical abilities to understand really like where the rubber meets the road with those existing laws and how we should be thinking about enforcement. That's one area that gets a lot of attention and I think could have a little bit more focus, like I said, in terms of really understanding how those laws could work in practice. But I think that, beyond looking at enforcement or applicability of existing law, really what regulation and governance, I think, to me, as someone who has both worked in policy and, building things like impact assessments for big technology companies, is what combining those two buckets is really all about, is coming up with a framework that is practical and implementable and a bit flexible for understanding what the types of problems are that you're trying to solve with this technology and how you've thought about them, right? And there are many, many ways to do that. Many companies are already sort of experimenting with these things. But the reality is that we don't really have standards or industry best practices that are well adopted around how to do those things. And I do think that some regulatory guidance around, what a model card should look like, what an impact assessment should look like, what are good documentation practices when it comes to describing what kind of AI capability you're trying to use look like. Things like, whether or not an organization has someone in charge of these initiatives. We've seen a lot of bills and proposals in the EU as well, put someone in charge of complying with privacy laws, a DPA, right, or a data protection officer. How do we think, can we think about that same sort of model in this context? Because I think what's really missing right now in industry is sort of this availability of standards and best practices around, what good looks like for governance in the AI space. And I think that regulators could really help provide some of that clarity.